Hi there, my name is Zach Schaefer. I'm the head builder here at the AK Guy Inc. Today we're taking a look at the Recreator Blanks US made AKM underfolder. So sometime last year, Recreator announced that they would be making a run of US made AK rifles. To what degree they're US made, I don't know. They haven't been super clear about it. So let's go through the various components on this rifle, and I'll point out which ones appear to be US made and which ones appear to be surplus. So starting off, this magazine didn't come with it. Pull the dust cover off. There's no markings anywhere. You can see there's a little bit of wrinkling down here, which doesn't affect anything, but that's usually an indicator of Romanian dust covers. They tend to have that stamping wrinkling there. Moving on. Recoil spring assembly. This kind of looks surplus just from the machining, but I can't really tell. There's not really any good giveaway, so it's either surplus or a good repro. Not sure. All right. Bolt carrier. Let's see. This looks surplus to me with the extremely rough tooling marks there. Again, like the dust cover, that doesn't really affect anything. It's just a giveaway. There's a little proof mark. There we go. Right there. So unless Recreator's putting that on there, I'd say that, oh, look, there's another one. Okay, this is probably Romanian. I've seen that on a Romanian carrier before. So this is probably a Romanian surplus carrier. The bolt here appears to be US made. See the tool marks on the head there? That's like a 3D profile that you would do on a modern CNC machine, where they'd use a little ball end mill and rough all this out. That and let's see, there's this little step here where this radius meets the feed lug there. I've never seen that on a surplus bolt, so I would say this bolt head is probably US made. Moving on, the receiver, of course, is a Recreator Blanks receiver. He's got all his marks down here in the trigger guard area. The front trunnion, which is probably everyone's biggest question, looks to be Recreator made to me. You especially see the CNC style looking tool marks here. And down inside that area. We'll get into this later, but there's a lot of giveaways. This is definitely a US made part. The rear sight block, can't quite say. It looks nice, whatever it is. I'd lean towards US made. Again, these kind of tool marks here that I've never seen on surplus, but either way, it looks pretty nice, doesn't matter. Gas tube here. This is one I'm pretty confused on. So if this is US made, it would be a very involved assembly. You can see these flutes that are stamped in here. I was looking into getting some gas tubes made a while back, and I was quoted $65,000 for having a die made to crimp all these flutes in. So if this is US made, it's pretty involved. Because I don't see any proof marks or anything on here. You can see these ferrules are bent outwards super hard. There you go. Yeah, so these ferrules are extremely blown out. Either way, I'd lean more towards surplus on this. Gas block here, you can totally see the 3D contour style tool marks there from modern CNC. And it's going to be hard to show. I'll put a drawing up on the screen, but this does have the gas chamber undercut that many AK repros are lacking, so that's pretty cool. The front sight block also looks repro to me. Again, nothing wrong with it. Looks fine to me. And I forgot to mention, the drum in the front sight is also very tight, so that's good. You don't want that thing walking around. All right, next up, the furniture. This lower handguard looks surplus Romanian to me. You can see the serial number there. They refinished it. It looks pretty good to me. Nothing really special to say. And I'll show you the barrel markings. You can see those markings there under the rear sight block. These look like AK builder barrels to me, and you can see that they are chrome lined, so this should be a pretty dang nice barrel. Let's check out the rear trunnion area. Pop in there, you can kind of see the rough finish here rough tooling marks down in there. And the fly cut finish on the back, I'd say this is a Hungarian rear trunnion. I've got several thousand of them in the shop, and they all look exactly like this. As for the stock, also appears to be Hungarian surplus, so these are both pretty good. Nothing wrong with them. Let's talk about why this rifle is here and why I'm doing the video on it. So the owner purchased this rifle from Recreator on Black Friday. He got it in, took it out to shoot, and was unable to zero the rifle due to canted sights or something of that nature. It came back from a warranty repair, at which point the rifle closed on a no-go gauge, meaning the headspace had grown or was set incorrectly. In addition, the rifle was also exhibiting strange wear where the bolt was hitting the bullet guide and gouging it. So he returned the rifle to Recreator again. When it came back this time, the front sight post was broken, which is something I've also seen. Sometimes the heat treat is bad. But the big problem with the rifle, and why the owner ultimately sent it to me, was what happened when he took it out to the range to shoot it. Two interesting things are going on here. Firstly, and obviously, the bolt carrier has jumped out of the rails. But secondly, you can see the recoil spring assembly has broken. So check out what happened to the recoil spring tab here. See how those two ears snapped off? We just dropped that in there to show you. And see that spring assembly is pointing upwards because it broke, which you could also see in the test fire video. And another casualty of whatever the hell happened there is the back of the dust cover. Hopefully you can see that. This entire edge is blown out right in the middle there. Let's see, get a good angle. Yeah, that whole edge there is popped out from whatever's going on. Okay, so if we drop the dust cover on the rifle, it is severely tweaked. I've got it set up in the notch up there, and I have to tweak it really hard to get it to sit down, which is, if we're in terms of AKs, that's not going to break anything, but it is indicative of something weird going on. So part of dust cover fitment is this little notch here. Man, this is hard to show. I'm sorry. There's a little notch right there. There you go. It blows inwards right here at the tip of the cover, which sits on that edge right there. And on this particular rifle, that is not the issue. See, the notch isn't even close to hitting. Because sometimes that notch will catch on this edge and make it look like the dust cover is warped when it's really not. I won't spend too much time here because it doesn't really matter that much, but the dust cover rocks severely. So I think it's just a warped cover. As for why it jumped the rails, let's see, I have a few theories. Okay, so my first theory, which I just disproved off camera, I will show you. So my theory was that this slot at the rear of the receiver where you disassemble the bolt carrier was out of spec. But comparing to the AKM receiver prints, we're looking for 43 millimeters, and that's a rounded edge, so you can't really measure it precisely. These are both pretty much right on 43. They look fine. And it wants 30 on the width. You might be able to see that. It's basically dead on. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Okay, next theory is that maybe it has something to do with the warped dust cover that's a little short. You can see how little engagement that dust cover has up there, it is hanging on by a thread. So I'm thinking that maybe during firing, you know, it flexed a little and this popped out, which you can see in the video. And then something to do with that popping out let this spring torque up a little, which then bent and let the carrier jump a little. So I can't really say this is a fault of Recreator or not. It seems like just a really weird one-off issue to me that happened to occur on this gun. And if I had to point fingers, I would say the dust cover being short is probably the issue. So let's throw calipers on the dust cover and see what the length is like and compare it to the receiver and see if the receiver length is in spec. Alright, I got my big boy calipers here. So the receiver overall length spec is 259 millimeters plus or minus 0.2. So let's see. Rock them on there. Yeah, so that's pretty much right on spec. A little on the short side, but that's pretty typical for a Recreator and usually doesn't affect anything. Okay, this is going to be difficult, but let's try and measure the dust cover. Drop it on the rearmost part to there. 236.5-ish. Let's go from there to there. 236.5-ish. So I'll put a little thing on the screen here with the factory print dimensions. Okay, so I just realized something. I was measuring to that part that blew out. I'm assuming they didn't blow that out at the factory when they were building this. So it's measured to the shortest section, which would be across there, I think. Let's try on... Sorry, I'm drifting off the camera. Let's try there. Roughly 236. A little less. Again, this is not super precise, but this is also dealing with sheet metal, so you can only be so precise on this shape. So yeah, you can see the two sides are pretty close to each other, and they are a good bit shorter than the minimum allowable length. So it looks like the dust cover was too short, and that's probably what caused the carrier jump issues. Some of you are probably going to point out, and rightfully so, that you can usually fire an AK without the dust cover, and it'll run just fine. It won't break anything, which is a really good point. And I'm pretty confused here, in case that wasn't clear. So let's try a surplus Hungarian recoil spring assembly and see what it does. Alright, so bear with me here. I'm yanking up on the carrier. I'm trying to force it to jump the rails. It doesn't want to. That seems fine. So, again, if I had to point fingers or give an educated guess on what's going on here, I think short dust cover, along with probably a defective recoil spring assembly, caused this. With surplus parts, they're usually pretty rock solid, but sometimes you will get some really weird issues just because they made millions and millions of them. They had really weird lives. I think this is probably to blame. So let's throw it on the hardness tester real quick and just see what's going on. Yeah, up towards the front we just got 37, so it's probably just a bad reading. Yeah, nothing crazy. Either way, it's pretty close, so that's probably not the issue. Alright, so next up, let's check out the rivets. This has some problem rivets. Firstly, this one right here used the good old paper test. Hopefully you can see that. Goes right under the rivet head. So the entire front and bottom of that rivet head are not touching. And if we flip it over, sorry about the camera work, flip it over here. That's the sticky side. There you go. See, the back end of that rivet is not touching. Not super bad, but not great. And I'll cut in some still images while I'm going through here. Let's see, the trigger guard rivets look fine. Nothing crazy going on there. The rear trunnion rivets all look fine. No air, no misshapen heads or anything. So that's all good. But yeah, that rivet is basically not doing anything. This rivet is doing like half its job. Alright, so I have a bore alignment rod inserted into the barrel and it passes freely, so the barrel is not bent or anything. Not that I suspected, but that's a good tip for you. And then if you slide it back, you can see that the line of the barrel winds up right in the middle of the rear trunnion, so the receiver is installed correctly parallel with the barrel. That can be an issue with surplus parts. A lot of them have the trunnion bored crooked, so you can press the barrel in and it'll be pointed off one way or the other. And your barrel will be straight, your receiver will be straight, you know, rivets will be good, but you'll have a crooked looking barrel from bad machining. So they did that correctly. Let's see if I can show you. You can see what's going on here. There we go. That looks like a pretty good angle. So this is fairly warped around here. You can see it's blown out here pretty hard. This isn't too bad, but it's definitely not good. That needs to be squished in. And in my experience with the Recreator receivers, having built on, I don't know, at least 50 of them, they tend to have this rail too long, like it needs to be machined, and this rail tends to be blown out. So you'll have to beat that one inwards and then cut this to actual spec. And when you install the selector, it will also warp this rail. So that might be related to whatever's going on here. You can see this wall is kind of a banana. Moving forward on the rifle, we will address the next two complaints that the owner had, which is canted sights and overgassing. So the first time this went back to Recreator for a return, it had sights that were misaligned in such a way that the rifle could not be zeroed. And apparently it still has that issue, or rather the issue came back. I'm not entirely clear. Either way, it's got a problem. And if you look down the sights, this is going to be fun to show. There we go. If you look down the sights, you may be able to see it in the video. The sight leaf here drifts off to the left at the rear. So instead of sitting straight along, it's sitting kind of like that. Hopefully you can see that, and I'll do some demonstrations here, which matches with the front sight post being all the way to the left. Over here at the surface plate again, I have the receiver set up with a 1, 2, 3 block on the top rails. A lot of people like to do it across the bottom of the receiver, but I have found that the bottom and the sides are rarely square, so it'll give you a false reading relative to the, you know, the action of the gun, all the parts that actually matter. So, 1, 2, 3 block there. We have the barrel up over here so that resting on the sight doesn't affect our measurement. And hopefully you can see, you're looking at the gap between the ears and the angles there. You can see the sight is pushed that way a little bit, but in my experience, I have found that as long as the ear is not touching either one of those squares, it'll be close enough to zero. So that's probably not the issue, but it's definitely contributing. Moving backwards, put one on the rear sight block, and this is going to be hard to show. Alright, hopefully you can see that. See the light down there? The square touches at the top, does not touch at the bottom, which means the rear sight block is spun that way. And to verify, we'll put a square on the other side. Okay, sorry, I had to get the lever out of the way. And put the block against there. It is also spun. So given that these two are off in the same direction, and seeing Recreator's tooling they've posted before, I think these blocks are straight relative to each other, but were installed in the gun at an angle, which is not exactly a deal breaker. Lots of factory AKs have that issue, but suboptimal. Okay, almost forgot the gas block. So I've got the squares touching the part that the gas tube sits over. You can see smaller gap here than over there, so it is spun in the same direction as the other two components. Okay, so if the barrel components are straight relative to each other, that means that the issue is either the barrel being not concentric, like the bore drifting off one way or the other, which is pretty common on surplus barrels, but not the case on this AK builder. This is really nice, and the concentricity is good. So that leaves one option, and I believe it to be the rear sight leaf being crooked, as previously mentioned. So I have this ejector pin here. These are extremely straight. Okay, I have the pin sitting in that notch to extend the line it makes. Try and illustrate this, and hopefully you can see that the sight is kicked off and it points to the left, which corresponds with that crooked front. So it looks to me like this is the issue. So to be clear, this crooked sight leaf issue is fairly common on surplus blocks, and it's very often misdiagnosed as a canted front sight block. Let me show you what I'm talking about and how to spot it. Okay, so what causes a canted rear sight leaf? Well, you may see that already. See this little keyway here? How that top is not in the middle of the bottom? That's one of the little giveaways that tells you something's probably wrong with the block. This is a Hungarian surplus block, and these ones are the worst in my experience for canted sight leafs. Almost every single one of them has a crooked sight leaf, which is why a lot of factory rifles, in my opinion, my theory, is why a lot of factory rifles will have a canted front sight block so that it's able to be zeroed because the leaf is kicked off. Anyway, how you spot it, other than putting a leaf in there and having it on a rifle, you take a little 3mm gauge pin or like a long 3mm drill bit. You drop it in there, and you may be able to see that on camera. Oh dang, I picked a good one. Yeah, that's pretty square. I say the Hungarian ones are usually crooked, and then I show you a square one. Let me grab a bad one. Okay, here's another one. Hopefully you can see that. That pin, if you have like the sidewall and that pin, they are not at 90 degrees. It's kicked up that way. That's pretty common because the sight leaf has these two little pegs that fit in those two notches, and that's what sets the rotation of it. This can be adjusted with a needle file by moving one side or the other over to a certain degree. Sometimes you'll run out of adjustment and you'll have to skim these ears too, which, as you can probably guess, is suboptimal, but it can work. Okay, let's get the leaf out. I have this Circle 7 Armory sight removal tool. I think you can get these at Arms of America. He sent this one to me for free, and it works great. Okay, so you rotate the gas tube block lever a little so that this hook can get in there. Hook it on there, lever it, and then be careful. Make sure to catch it because this will shoot all the way across your shop. Get that out. All right, got the spring out. Let's look at the alignment. Come on over here. Let's see. That looks pretty straight. Okay, I think I found the problem. Let's see if you can see that. The pin won't quite go to the top because this paint is so damn thick. I'm wondering maybe these ears aren't sliding in correctly. Let me scrape off the paint and try the sight in there. Okay, so I just used a super fine jeweler's file and just scraped the paint off, and now that pin gauge sits in there good. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. That is pretty much dead on. So my initial theory of the pin being drilled crooked like the Hungarian blocks, I do not believe that was correct. So in that case, it's probably, off the camera, it's probably these two ears not being perfect with each other. You can actually see that ear has a little bit of damage on there. I'll try cleaning that up and come back. Okay, I missed that in the initial overview. This is a super early Romanian rear sight leaf. It's got some electro pencil serial there. It's got this lightning cut. It's not quite in the middle. That's how they're designed. That's one of the ways you can tell. Pretty cool. But yeah, it's got some damage. I got the damage cleaned off and put the sight back in, and it is slightly better, but it is still crooked. It's going to be really hard to show. It is still pointed off to the left. Hopefully you can see that. It gets closer to this side of the gun than the other side. So it's a little better, but I think at this point it's probably a crooked, that this sight was just not machined properly, which is not entirely uncommon. So I'll swap this sight out and continue on my merry way. But summary, I don't think this is Recreator's fault. They should have caught it, that the rifle wouldn't zero, but it looks like this is all assembled pretty well. Okay, so moving on to the first big issue on this gun. The locking lugs in the front trunnion are not machined correctly. This is going to be a bit difficult to explain, but I will do my best. So let's bring that up, and I will try to show you. Okay, hopefully you can see this. See how that little edge right at the tip of my finger? It should be perfectly 90 degrees to that edge. Instead, it is angled down that way. Looks like that. Exaggerated, of course. So that is a result of machining this the way that looks obvious if you have a CNC, where you take a front trunnion and you cut it from the front. And I'll show you a little demonstration. I'm going to try my best to explain what I think Recreator or their machine shop did here and why it didn't work. So this is a surplus Hungarian front trunnion. And you can see that this diameter here is smaller than where the locking lugs are. So this is an undercut. So my little example of a straight end mill doesn't quite work here because you wouldn't be able to reach, but it's just for demonstration. What I think they did is they came in with an end mill and cut the locking lugs like that. And what that does is it creates a dished surface. So instead of a flat locking lug like it's supposed to have, it'll be very slightly dished. And depending on the size of the end mill and the direction they come in from, maybe they came in at an angle, that would result in the angled lug we're seeing here. And several other reproduction front trunnions that have been known to be problematic did the locking lugs the same way. So how the Soviets did it is they used a boring bar on a lathe. Now you can see the tip of this boring bar is at an angle, and you know it's obviously been messed with, but that's not relevant. So ideally this end would be square at 90 degrees, but just for demonstration purposes, they would come in with a boring bar and sweep it around, basically a form cutter or single point cutting, and they'd create that surface with a boring bar, and that would lead to the flat 90-degree lugs I was talking about. And flat lugs is kind of a misnomer because these lugs are helical. They're part of a screw, basically, so as you start there and sweep that way, the lug progresses to the rear so that when the bolt locks up, it screws itself in, and when the bolt unlocks, it screws itself out. It helps with extraction. So again, if you pretend this was a square boring bar, they would come in that way and sweep it around like that as it progressed inward. Okay, cool. So I'm over here rambling about helixes and locking lugs and stuff. What does that mean? So what that means is when the lugs in the trunnion are machined incorrectly, the bolt will be locking up incorrectly. You won't have the entire lug in contact with the lugs in the trunnion. So what that means is that the force is being applied over a much smaller area than it was intended to, and the bolt will deform, which is exactly what's happening here. Come on and focus, please. There we go. And see that peening on the left lug there? If I can roll it over, hopefully you can see that. Oh, there you go. Okay, there you go. You can see the top of that lug is peening over, or rather the side. Catch my fingernail on it. You can see that entire left lug, come on, entire left lug is only touching on the outside edge, which is exactly what happens when you machine the lugs wrong. The right lug is a little better. Most of it's touching, and I'm not sure how they managed to make the left lug not touch and the right lug mostly touch. Yeah, so there's your lug contact. Okay, the next issue on the bolt is the cam lug. See that section of peening there? That edge is rounding over. So what does that edge do, and why is it rounding over? So the AK has what we like to call the flat spot and the bump surface. And I'll explain what that means. So imagine this bolt carrier is riding through the receiver in the AK, anywhere other than locked up. As it rides through, if you apply rearward force to the bolt, it doesn't move, because this cam that locks the bolt over there cannot act, because there's a little tiny flat spot on here, and the flat on the bolt sits on the flat down in there, and it doesn't move until a spot in the trunnion kicks that off and allows it to move. Here's the surface I'm talking about down here in the trunnion, which hits this surface here on the bolt. So there's that piece outside of the trunnion for easier demonstration. See this ramp here with the dual angle. The bolt comes through, and they hit, and it rotates the bolt just a little so that the cam can take over. Okay, so how is that relevant to this rifle in the wear? Well, this edge here is hand fitted on each gun at the factory for AKs. So you often hear that. So in this case, what happened is this face here is not cut properly to fit the Recreator rifle. What it looks like is that the bolt is rotating too late. So the bolt is running into the barrel as it's hitting that, which creates like a 3-point bind and kind of smashes the bolt into the carrier, and it just kind of wiggles and then locks up. Instead of what's supposed to happen, where it'll ride in, start kicking over, cam takes over, it starts rotating, and then it gets somewhere near the barrel. This can actually be fairly difficult to time correctly. I've seen, lots of factory rifles with this same problem. KUSA guns, Wassers, Zastavas, old like Yugo kits, Romanian kits. It does happen from time to time. So this isn't a deal breaker per se immediately, but in some cases, after high round counts, that edge will roll over completely. And then this bolt will rotate prematurely inside the rails while the gun is cycling, and it'll bind up and do all sorts of terrible things. Okay, what else is going on with the bolt? Well, you may be able to see that right off the bat. It has ridiculously excessive firing pin protrusion. So I have the Soviet armorer gauge for that, 1.4 millimeters on the go side, 1.52 on the no-go. So let's start with the go. Push the pin in, put the go on, and you can see I have to push the pin down to get the go on, so that's not a good start. Flip it to the no-go side. Sorry, I'm looking through the camera here. Through the no-go side, and it is a very big fail. That is not even close. So what does that mean? It means that this firing pin is sticking out way too far, and it will likely start piercing primers if it doesn't already, because I have not fired this rifle since receiving it. Hopefully you found part 1 of this video to be informative as to what's going on with this rifle, what to look for on your rifle, and maybe help diagnose issues. In part 2, I will be going through what we did to repair this rifle once we get to that point, and I'll be doing a test fire before we tear it down. The owner of this rifle also complained that it was severely overgassed, so I'll be looking into the gas port as well after firing and showing what happens. Thanks for watching.